Yeah, today we're going to look at the cognitive skill of evaluation, which is the final of our four assessment objectives or cognitive skills that appear in our assessment, external assessment. So, with evaluation, then essentially we're looking at ways in which we can judge the worth or the value of something relative to other things. Okay. So similar to the other processes that we've looked at, there's a multi-step process that we work through, and your finished piece of writing should reflect this process and the steps that are in it. Okay, so to begin with, we look at we have to determine the purpose and criteria for the evaluation. So this is basically, well, why are we evaluating and how are we evaluating? And as ever, in this case, we use the question here to frame the approach that we will take. Generally speaking, when we're looking at evaluation, we're probably looking at two key areas of usefulness and reliability as our key areas that we'll discuss. But again, I have to stress that it depends on what the question is asking us to do. All right, so once we've done that, we then need to examine our evidence. Okay, we need to look at the available evidence in order to apply and understand what we're going to apply the criteria or those aspects to. Then what we'll do is determine the merit, value, or significance of the ideas, work, solutions, or methods. So here we are applying our criteria that we're using. So it could be how useful is the source in answering this question, or how reliable is the evidence that we may gather from that evidence in order to reach a decision or to justify a decision. And again, it's about us selecting the best available evidence that is presented to us. Okay. When we select that evidence, we need to discuss it. So we need to talk about its strength, its limitations, its weaknesses, and the implications that come from that. So that's sort of the so what's, that if we accept that a source is biased, does that make it something that we can't use in developing this argument? Should we just ignore this because of that bias? Okay, so those sorts of things can influence what we're doing. And in that section, that's where we're going to consider going back and considering our features of evidence again: our origin, our motive, our audience, our perspective, our context, implicit and explicit meanings in doing so. So once we've done that, we obviously organise and develop our response. We sequence our ideas effectively, and then to finish the process off, we have to review what we've done. We have to go back and double check that the criteria or parameters that the question set out, we have covered and addressed those in our written response. So what we need to do now then is we'll work our way through this question and look at a sample response. So as ever, our very first thing we have to do is we need to read the question before we consider the evidence or do anything else. It's just read and interpret and understand what the question is getting us to do. So in a properly constructed paragraph, response of 180 to 200 words, complete the following question. So we know what we've got to write, a paragraph. We know how long the paragraph needs to be, 180 to 200 words. Again, as I've said to you, the further you move through the course into senior, the more important those word counts become. Okay, because excessive word limit may result in responses not being marked, or that they will mark up to the response will be marked up to the word limit, and anything outside of that will be just ignored. Okay, rightio. So we're given a statement: blame for the Great Fire can be given to Nero. Evaluate the reliability of sources 1 and 2 and make a judgment about each source's usefulness for responding to the statement. Okay, so really in what we're doing here is we're deciding whether or not source 1 and 2 can help us support or prove the statement in the question. So the key word there is judgment. When we see judgment, we're knowing we understand that is going to be evaluating. Okay, so with this question then we're giving scaffolding, and our response should include a clear statement on the reliability of each source, a clear statement of the usefulness of each source in order to respond to the statement, and use of evidence from the sources to support judgments. So we've got to address reliability, we've got to address usefulness, and we have to use evidence from the source to demonstrate those claims that we're making. All right, now, even though we have our scaffolding in this order, we may choose not to do it in that order. It doesn't mean that you have to follow that structure. So you may talk about usefulness first and say, look, sources 1 and 2 are useful in helping us get that done, and here's how. And then you might want to discuss the reliability of it after that. Alternatively, you might want to talk about reliability first to say, well, it is worth devoting time and utilising evidence from these sources, and this is how we can make use of it to prove our statement. Either way is fine, but we need to ensure that we're doing both, discussing reliability and usefulness, and we're using evidence directly from the sources, both source 1 and source 2. All right, so here we have a sample response. Now that basically looks at, there's a clear statement to begin there. Sources 1 and 2 clearly blame the Great Fire on Nero. Typo there on my part. Tacitus's account is a primary source, but his senatorial background creates bias in it. So what we're doing there then straight away is we're going to the reliability of the evidence. So I haven't signposted that, and that might be something that I might want to include, just to let the marker know that I'm going into and looking at that there. So I'm talking about him as a primary source, which means we're addressing context of production. And his senatorial background gives us an idea on his origin, so his personal background and how that might create bias there. All right, so although he doesn't directly accuse Nero, Tacitus's dislike of the absolute power that Nero had is implied in his writing. So there again, I'm explaining and justifying why I think he has bias. And I'm also working in this idea of implicit meaning, which is another one of our features of evidence. However, Tacitus still provides evidence that is useful in showing Nero's guilt. He describes torches being thrown by men crying that they acted under orders. So there I've used a direct quote from the source, I've referenced it, I've integrated it into the sentence, and I've used quotation marks. So what I've done there is I've discussed the reliability of the source, I've demonstrated the usefulness of the source by including a quote that shows how it can be used to show that Nero was to blame for the fire. So that idea that under orders was coming from someone higher up. As I say here, these orders would have been given by someone in authority, potentially Nero. This accusation of guilt is corroborated by Suetonius in source 2. So here I am building my case for the accuracy of the statement by using that word corroborated. So it's not just Tacitus, who we know there's an element of bias there that's saying it, it's also Suetonius. So again, I'm implying there that Suetonius is useful to us in responding to the and proving the statement to be true. All right, Suetonius's access to the Royal Archives gave him the opportunity to use evidence that other writers didn't have the chance to see, making his work reliable despite the accusation that he sensationalized his stories. So again here, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at the origins of the ideas and things, and the way in which Suetonius worked. So we know that he worked as a good historian because he accessed his sources. And at the same time there, I'm also acknowledging that, there is a weakness and a criticism of his work, is it really is considered a bit of a gossip at times, a bit of a gossip columnist. All right, so then we move on to say Suetonius explicitly lays the blame on Nero, stating he had done it so openly that people dared not lay hands on his men. So that use of the word explicitly there again signposts that I'm utilising another one of those features of evidence that are so important to us in analysis, and in this case, evaluation, and that it clearly links the source to showing that Nero was to blame for it. Then I go on to say this confirms Tacitus's conclusion. So there I finally tie it all together and try to finish the knot that ties source 1 with source 2. Suetonius also comments that Nero showed little interest in the well-being of his subjects and their city in plotting its destruction. Here I've paraphrased from the source, but still acknowledged where it's come from. And then finally, clearly then, the ancient sources point the finger at Nero as being responsible for the fire. So, in that response, I have discussed the reliability of the sources. I've shown their usefulness in improving the statement that appears in the question. So I've done the sorts of things that I need to do. It probably could be organised a little bit better. I could be signposting a few things a little bit more effectively, but that's why it's a sample response and not an exemplar response. And that's where it's now your turn to produce the exemplar response by thinking about what you're doing and how you're communicating your skill of evaluation.